The breech slams home. 7 kilograms of steel and high-explosive lock into the chamber of a Paquet 40 anti-tank gun somewhere in the Anzio beachhead, January 1944. The gun doesn't know whose hands are on its controls anymore. 30 seconds ago, it belonged to the Wehrmacht. Now American fingers grip the traverse wheel, and the barrel is swinging. Not toward the Allied line, but back down the road it just covered. The Pak 40 was the best anti-tank gun Germany ever fielded. 75 millimeters of precision, Krupp engineering, capable of punching through 4 inches of armor at 500 meters. It had killed Shermans across North Africa, killed them at Sicily, and for the past 6 hours, this particular gun had been killing anything American that moved on a road outside Cisterna. The crew knew their work. They dug the trails in properly and cleared the sight lines, ammunition stacked within arm's reach. Everything by the book. Then the book stopped applying. An American squad, 11 men, maybe 12, the records aren't perfectly clear, had crawled close enough to smell the propellant. They came through a drainage ditch the Germans hadn't bothered to watch. Why would they? The gun was positioned to stop armor, not infantry. Infantry was someone else's problem. By the time the first German gunner turned his head, American bayonets were already inside the emplacement. The fight lasted under a minute. Most of the crew never fired a shot. The ones who survived ran, and they ran straight into the column that was forming behind them. Trucks, half-tracks, a towed artillery piece, infantry clustered around vehicles for the morning push. The column that assumed the anti-tank position was still theirs. Now one of those Americans is sighting down a German barrel at a German half-track. He's never trained on this weapon. The controls are labeled in German. The ammunition is marked in German. Everything about this gun screams foreign. The weight of the cocking handle, the unfamiliar recoil mechanism. He fires anyway. The first round catches the lead half-track in the engine block. The vehicle shudders and stops. Behind it, the column accordions. Drivers slam brakes. Officers shout orders that nobody can hear over the ringing echo of a gun that shouldn't be pointed in that direction. A second round goes out before the Germans understand what's happening. A third. The Pak 40's crew, American now, works through the ammunition the original gunners had so helpfully stacked. A German officer watching the chaos from 300 meters back would later describe the next 90 seconds as incomprehensible. That's his word. Incomprehensible. Because the doctrine said this couldn't happen. You didn't lose anti-tank positions to infantry rushes in broad daylight. You didn't have your own guns turned against your own column before the barrel had cooled. And yet, the gun that had been killing Americans all morning was now killing Germans, worked by men who'd learned its operation in real time, under fire, through nothing but mechanical intuition and rage. The shells didn't care whose hands loaded them. Physics has no nationality. This is what German soldiers learned at Anzio, over and over, in ways their training had never prepared them for. American infantry didn't follow the rules. They improvised, grabbed whatever was available and made it work, turned your strengths into your vulnerabilities in the time it took to blink. You won't find this in most histories of the Italian campaign. The textbooks focus on Cassino, on the stalemate, on the mud. They skip the small unit actions where American NCOs made decisions that would have gotten them court-martialed in any European army, and won because of it. A like helps the algorithm show this to the people who care about what actually happened. Subscribe if you want more of what the textbooks leave out. And if you know another story like this one, drop it in the comments. The PAK-40 kept firing until the column scattered. By the time German mortars found the position, the Americans were gone. The gun sat there in its emplacement, barrel warm, breech open, surrounded by spent brass. German gun, German dead. Everything German except the outcome. The smell hit you first. Salt marshes, diesel exhaust, and something else. The sweet rot stench of bodies that couldn't be recovered because recovering them meant dying yourself. That was Anzio in January 1944. 35,000 men crammed into a beachhead 7 miles deep and 15 miles wide, with nowhere to hide and nowhere to go. The landing itself had been almost unopposed. Allied planners called it Operation Shingle, an end run around the Gustav Line, a dagger aimed at Rome's soft underbelly. 6th Corps came ashore on January 22nd, expecting a sprint to the capital. What they got was a siege. The problem was the Alban Hills. They rose 18 miles inland, a volcanic ridge that dominated everything below. German observers sat up there with telescopes and radios, watching every vehicle that moved, every latrine that got dug, every supply dump that grew too large. Artillery spotters called in fire missions on individual trucks. The beachhead had no depth, no cover, and no secrets. The British had faced something similar at Gallipoli in 1915. A landing that achieved surprise, then stalled within sight of its objectives while the enemy fortified the high ground. Winston Churchill, who championed both operations, watched Anzio unfold with the particular horror of a man seeing his mistake repeated. The parallels were close enough to hurt. Front lines stabilized within grenade range. Soldiers dug into the same waterlogged soil that Italian farmers had spent centuries draining, and the water table pushed back. Trenches flooded. Foxholes became ponds. Men lived in mud that sucked at their boots and rotted their feet, while German artillery searched for them with methodical precision. Everything was visible. Nothing was safe. The Germans called it the Hexenkessel, the witch's cauldron. American soldiers had cruder names, but they agreed on one thing. Standard tactics didn't work here. Maneuvering drew fire. Massing for attacks meant being observed while you massed. Even field kitchens were forbidden. Smoke drew shells, so they adapted. Patrols went out at night, not just for reconnaissance, but for equipment. German gear became survival currency. A captured MG-42 meant firepower without the supply chain. A liberated radio meant communications the enemy couldn't intercept. And captured artillery, guns like the PAK-40, meant hitting back with ammunition that didn't have to cross the beach under fire. The official after-action reports note these captures in dry bureaucratic language. Enemy equipment utilized. Hostile weapons employed against former owners. What the reports don't capture is the desperation that drove it. Men who hadn't slept in 72 hours, whose units had been bled to half strength, whose supply situation bordered on catastrophic. These men saw a working German gun and didn't think about doctrine. They thought about killing the people trying to kill them. One intelligence officer's assessment put it bluntly. American infantry at Anzio demonstrated a disturbing tendency to treat enemy equipment as their own. Disturbing to whom, exactly, he didn't specify. Presumably, the Germans. The beachhead bred a particular kind of soldier. Not the parade ground kind, not the by-the-book kind. The kind who learned that survival meant flexibility and initiative mattered more than orders, that a German gun pointing the wrong way was worth more than an American gun that hadn't arrived yet. This was the environment that produced the Paquet 40 incident, not an aberration, a logical outcome. When you live under constant observation, when every position is temporary and every asset is borrowed time, you stop thinking about what belongs to whom. You think about what works, and American soldiers, raised on machine shops and tractor repairs, and a culture that said figure it out yourself, proved remarkably good at making things work. The Germans noticed. They couldn't help but notice. Their own equipment kept showing up in places it shouldn't be, operated by people who shouldn't know how to operate it. The Alban Hills still watched everything, but what they saw, increasingly, was improvisation on a scale their doctrine had no answer for. The Paquet 40 was better than anything the Americans had. This wasn't propaganda or morale-boosting exaggeration from German training manuals. It was ballistic fact, measurable in muzzle velocity and penetration tables, and the burned-out hulks of Allied armor scattered across 3 continents. The 75mm round left the barrel at 790 meters per second, fast enough that tank crews never heard the shot that killed them. At 500 meters, it punched through 106 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. The Sherman's frontal plate measured 51 millimeters. Do the math. American soldiers did. They watched Shermans brew up from hits they couldn't trace, saw crews bail out of vehicles that were already coffins, learned to recognize the particular sound of a Paquet 40 shot, the crack that arrived after the impact because the round traveled faster than the noise it made. They developed a healthy respect for the gun. Then, they developed something closer to obsession. The problem was that America's own anti-tank arsenal couldn't compete. The 37mm gun that infantry units dragged around in 1942 was already obsolete when it shipped. Soldiers called it the door knocker. It announced your presence without accomplishing much else. The 57mm that replaced it was better, but better meant adequate against medium armor at close range. Against the newer Panzer IVs showing up in Italy, adequate was optimistic. The towed 76mm M5 existed, but it was a converted anti-aircraft gun, too heavy, too slow to deploy, too visible, too dependent on dedicated transport. Tank destroyers mounted bigger guns, but tank destroyers were vehicles that needed roads and fuel and maintenance. Infantry needed something a squad could manhandle into a ditch, something that disappeared after firing and hit hard enough to matter. The Paquet 40 was exactly that gun. German designers had solved the problem American ordnance was still working on. Low profile, manageable weight, 1,400 kilograms, light enough for a crew of 5 to reposition by hand, and penetration that made every Allied tanker nervous. The gun had earned its reputation the hard way, in North Africa and Russia, where it stopped Soviet T-34s that had previously seemed unstoppable. By 1944, German anti-tank crews understood they were operating the finest weapon of its class in the world. That confidence showed in how they positioned it. The standard doctrine placed Pa 40s in interlocking fields of fire, each gun covering its neighbor's flanks, with infantry screens to handle exactly the kind of approach the American squad used at Cisterna. The doctrine assumed the gun would never be approached unseen. The doctrine assumed too much. A captured German artillery officer, interrogated at Anzio in February 1944, offered an assessment that found its way into intelligence summaries. "The Americans do not respect the integrity of positions," he said. "They appear at angles the tactical situation does not permit." That phrasing stayed with the intelligence analysts. Angles the tactical situation does not permit. The German officer wasn't complaining about American strength. He was complaining about American illegibility. His maps showed where infantry could approach and where they couldn't. The Americans hadn't read his maps. The deeper problem was what happened after capture. German troops were trained specialists. A PK-40 crew spent months learning their weapon, the sight adjustments, the ammunition types, the maintenance requirements. The gun's manual ran to dozens of pages of technical specifications. American infantry figured it out in under a minute, not perfectly. Not with the precision of trained crews, but well enough to put rounds on target, while the original owners were still processing what had happened. The breach operated on mechanical principles that transcended language. Turn this wheel, the gun traverses. Pull this lever, it fires. The mechanisms were obvious once you looked at them. This was the nightmare scenario German doctrine never addressed, that their technical superiority could be turned against them faster than they could react. A captured rifle was one thing. A captured heavy weapon, operated competently within 60 seconds of seizure, was something else entirely. It suggested that American soldiers possessed skills the Wehrmacht hadn't accounted for. Mechanical intuition that didn't require manuals, adaptability that didn't wait for orders. The PK-40 crews at Anzio began developing new anxieties, not just about American artillery or American air power, but about the Americans themselves. About what might come crawling through a drainage ditch while you were watching the road. The drainage ditch ran 18 inches deep in black water that smelled like centuries of Italian agriculture mixed with something sharper, cordite residue washing down from the gun positions above. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy would have recognized it. He was fighting the same kind of ground a few miles away, learning the same lessons about Italian drainage that every American at Anzio learned. These weren't natural features. They were man-made channels, some of them dating back to Roman engineers who drained the Pontine marshes 2,000 years before the Wehrmacht showed up. The ditches connected. They formed networks. And the Germans, focused on the roads that tanks would use, hadn't mapped them all. The squad moving toward Cisterna that morning knew the ditches better than the Germans did. They'd been living in them for 2 weeks, learning which ones flooded at high tide and which offered cover from the Alban Hills observers. They knew the dead ends too, channels that swallowed into marshland and went nowhere. This knowledge hadn't come from intelligence briefings. It came from survival. The patrol order was reconnaissance. Locate German positions, report back, avoid contact. Standard language for a standard mission. But the NCO leading the squad understood what the order really meant. Find out what's killing our guys on that road and figure out if we can do something about it. They'd left their foxholes before dawn, moving single file through water that numbed their legs and soaked their ammunition. The M1 rifles would fire wet. The Garand was forgiving that way. But the Browning automatic rifleman had wrapped his weapon in an oilcloth anyway. Habits from training died hard, even when training stopped mattering. The sound reached them first. Not the gun firing. That would have meant someone else was dying. But the mechanical noise of a weapon being serviced, metal on metal, the distinctive clank of a breech block being cycled, German voices, casual, the tone of men who believed they were safe. The squad leader held up a fist. Movement stopped. 11 men, the records conflict on whether there were 12, pressed themselves into the mud walls of the ditch and listened. The gun was close, 30 meters, maybe less. The voices suggested 4 or 5 crew members, which matched what everyone knew about PAK-40 operations. No infantry screen audible, no machine gun positions covering the ditch. The Germans had followed their doctrine. Position the anti-tank gun to cover the road, protect it with fields of fire from other positions. The problem was that those other positions were hundreds of meters away, covering other approaches. This ditch fell into the gap between them. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. The squad leader made a gesture, 2 fingers pointing toward the voices, then a closed fist pumping twice. In Army hand signals, this meant assault. In the language that exhausted men develop after weeks of shared terror, it meant something more specific. We're taking that gun, and we're taking it now, before anyone has time to think about why this is a bad idea. He didn't radio headquarters, didn't request supporting fire, didn't consult the patrol order that explicitly said, avoid contact. The NCO saw an opportunity, and he took it, because waiting meant the opportunity would disappear. They came out of the ditch like men who'd been waiting their whole lives for this. Bayonets fixed, no firing, noise would alert the covering positions. The German gunners turned at the sound of splashing water and saw Americans already inside their perimeter, closer than arm's length, moving with a speed that didn't match the mud-caked, hollow-eyed wrecks they'd been told to expect. The fight was over before it qualified as a fight. 2 Germans went down before they could reach weapons. 2 more ran. The last one, a loader, young, his hands still full of shell casings he'd been organizing, simply froze. An American private shoved him toward the ditch with a rifle butt. Prisoner. Problem for later. Now the squad leader faced a decision no field manual had ever covered. He had a working anti-tank gun, an unknown amount of ammunition, and a German column forming somewhere behind the position. His orders said reconnaissance. His instinct said something else. The gun was already loaded. The Germans had been preparing for a morning fire mission, shells stacked and ready. He looked down the barrel. The road stretched away toward German lines, and on that road, vehicles were moving. 30 feet separated the drainage ditch from the gun emplacement. Open ground, every meter visible to German observers on the Alban Hills through their Zeiss optics. It should have been suicide. The squad crossed it in 4 seconds. The first American over the lip of the ditch was a corporal from Pennsylvania, farm country, the kind of place where boys learn to move fast and quiet through pre-dawn darkness because deer didn't wait for clumsy hunters. He hit the nearest German with the butt of his Garand before the man finished turning around. The sound was wet, final. The corporal was already moving to the next target. What the training manuals called close combat bore no resemblance to this. The manuals assumed opponents facing each other, assuming positions, following the logic of attack and defense. This was butchery dressed in olive drab. The Germans never had time to become opponents. They were obstacles, briefly animate, then not. The smell of the emplacement was different from the ditch. Gun oil, cordite residue baked into sandbags by weeks of firing, the particular metallic tang of brass casings heated by Italian sun. One American later described it as a machine shop that killed people. The comparison wasn't poetic. It was precise. The loader who froze was maybe 19. His hands stayed full of shell casings, even after the rifle butt shoved him toward the ditch, fingers locked around brass like it might protect him. His face showed something beyond fear, incomprehension so complete it registered as blankness. The training he'd received, the doctrine he'd memorized, none of it covered Americans appearing from impossible angles with mud in their hair and murder in their movements. 4 seconds, 5 dead or captured, 1 gun intact. The squad leader didn't celebrate. He was already at the breach, hands running over mechanisms he'd never touched before, mind racing through everything he'd heard about German artillery from men who'd survived being on the wrong end of it. The traverse wheel was obvious. So was the elevation crank. The sight picture required adjustment. He didn't have time to figure out, so he ignored it. Point and shoot. Close enough would have to be good enough. "Get down," he said. Not shouted. The Germans in the covering positions hadn't reacted yet. The assault had been too fast, too quiet. Noise discipline still mattered. His men dropped behind the sandbag wall and waited. The road was 400 meters out. Standard engagement range for a PK-40 against armor. Well within lethal distance for soft-skinned vehicles. A column of trucks was forming at what looked like a staging area. Supply vehicles, maybe troop carriers, hard to tell at this distance without proper optics. They were preparing to move toward the front, toward positions the squad had left hours ago, toward Americans who didn't know they were coming. The squad leader could radio a warning. He could withdraw with his prisoner and report the intelligence. He could follow his orders. He pulled the firing lanyard instead. The gun kicked. 75 millimeters of German engineering sent a round downrange at 790 meters per second, and the sound, that distinctive crack, echoed across the beachhead, for the first time pointed in the wrong direction. The first truck didn't explode. It stopped. The round had hit the engine block, and steam or smoke, impossible to tell which, poured from under the hood. Men spilled out of the back, scattering for cover that didn't exist because they'd never expected fire from this direction. Their own gun, their own position, their own doctrine betraying them. A German NCO's after-action report, recovered weeks later from a captured headquarters, contained a single sentence about this moment. Fire was received from an impossible azimuth. Impossible. Their word. The squad leader was already reloading. The shells were heavy, 6.8 kilograms each, but the breech mechanism worked exactly the way intuition said it should. Open, insert, close, fire. A private who'd worked in his father's garage before the war took over traverse duties without being asked. Another man, a former machinist, started organizing the remaining ammunition by type. No one had trained them for this. No one had needed to. The second round hit a truck carrying ammunition. This one exploded. The reticle made no sense. German numbers, German graduations, German logic encoded in glass and metal that assumed months of training the squad leader didn't have. He squinted through the sight and saw hash marks that meant nothing, range estimations calibrated for eyes that understood the system. The column was reforming 400 meters out. He had maybe 90 seconds before someone figured out what was happening. The brass casing from the second shot was still smoking at his feet, the acrid bite of propellant mixing with the sweeter smell of the ammunition truck burning in the distance. His hands were shaking, not fear, adrenaline, the body's chemical response to doing something impossible and surviving it. The traverse wheel turned smoothly under his palm, too smoothly. He overcorrected, lost the column, found it again. A private was feeding shells into position beside him, hands blackened with German grease, working by feel, because watching the sight picture was the squad leader's job. The shells clinked against each other, with a sound like church bells heard from very far away. 23 rounds remained. The Germans had been well supplied. "Elevation's wrong," someone said. The former machinist, studying the mechanism with the detached curiosity of a man examining a lathe he'd never operated but understood anyway. "You're shooting high. See that wheel? Bring it down 2 clicks. 2 clicks." The machinist didn't know German range tables either. He was guessing based on where the first rounds had landed, applying the logic of trajectory to a weapon he'd encountered 90 seconds ago. The squad leader turned the wheel, metal ground against metal, a sound he could feel through his palms. The third round hit a half-track, not center mass. The shot was still high, catching the vehicle where the armored cab met the open bed. But high explosive didn't care about precision. The half-track lurched sideways, smoke pouring from wounds the squad leader couldn't see from this distance, and men tumbled from the back in postures that suggested they wouldn't be getting up. Now the Germans understood. The squad leader watched through the sight as soldiers stopped scattering and started pointing at the gun position, pointing at the muzzle flash that had come from their own emplacement, their own weapon, turned against them by men who shouldn't have known how to operate it. A machine gun opened up from somewhere to the left. Rounds cracked overhead, close enough to feel the displaced air, close enough that the instinct to duck nearly overwhelmed the need to keep firing. The sandbags absorbed the first burst. The second burst kicked dirt into the squad leader's eyes. He fired blind, felt the gun kick, heard the round leave, blinked until vision returned. The column was moving now, not toward the American lines, but away, vehicles reversing in the chaos, drivers making the same calculation every soldier made when fire came from an impossible direction. Get away. Figure out what happened later. The former machinist was already adjusting elevation again. Lower. You're still high. Fourth round. A truck trying to turn caught it in the fuel tank. The fireball was visible for miles, had to be visible to the observers on the Alban Hills, who were watching their own logistics burn. "Last magazine," the private said. 19 rounds left. The machine gun was still firing, and now rifle shots were joining it, German infantry closing on the position from 2 directions. The squad leader did the math. 19 rounds. Unknown number of vehicles still mobile. Maybe 3 minutes before German infantry reached the emplacement. His orders, which he'd ignored an hour ago, suddenly seemed relevant again. "Fall back," he said. "Take the prisoner. Leave the gun." But he didn't stop firing. 5 more rounds, each one a little more accurate than the last, as his hands learned the German wheels, and his eyes learned to ignore the incomprehensible reticle. The loader from the original crew, the 19-year-old with the frozen hands, watched from the ditch as Americans destroyed his supplies with his gun, and his face showed something new. A German officer, captured 3 days later during the counterattack that nearly pushed the Allies into the sea, was asked about the incident during interrogation. "We did not train for this," he said. "We trained for soldiers. These were mechanics." The word wasn't meant as a compliment. It landed as something else entirely. What do you do when your own artillery kills your own men? The question paralyzed the German column for 11 seconds. The after-action report recorded the interval precisely. 11 seconds between the first round impact and the first order given. In combat, 11 seconds is geological time. Enough for 2 more rounds to find targets. Enough for a fuel truck to become a funeral pyre. Enough for panic to spread through vehicles full of men who'd been told the road was secure. The column commander was a Hauptmann named Riker. His personnel files survived the war. His body didn't. He was 41 years old, a reservist pulled from a transportation unit in Bavaria, experienced enough to know that anti-tank fire from your own gun position meant one of 2 things. Either your gunners had gone insane, or someone else was operating the weapon. Neither option had a doctrine response. The manual covered enemy artillery. It covered air attack. It covered partisan ambush and mechanical failure and driver error. It did not cover Americans appearing from drainage ditches to turn German engineering against German logistics. Riker's first order was to halt the column. His second was to send a runner toward the gun position to find out what was happening. The runner made it 30 meters before the 4th round hit the ammunition truck and the fireball forced everyone flat. By the time Riker looked up, 3 more vehicles were burning, and the runner had crawled back behind a wheel well, his mission abandoned. The covering positions responded before Riker could formulate his third order. Machine gun fire raked the sandbag emplacement, rounds cracking against dirt and stone with the distinctive sound of MG-42s, 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound every man on the beachhead had learned to fear. But the gun kept firing. 5th round, 6th. Someone behind those sandbags was still alive, still working the breach, still sending 75-millimeter shells into vehicles that couldn't move because they were blocked by burning wreckage in front and panicking drivers behind. Riker faced the mathematics of command. His column carried supplies for the counterattack scheduled in 3 days: ammunition, fuel, rations, the material that would push the Americans into the sea. Every vehicle lost here was a vehicle that wouldn't reach the staging area. Every minute spent under fire from an impossible direction was a minute closer to complete destruction. He could assault the position. Send infantry through the covering positions, close with the gun, retake it, or destroy it. But his infantry was 200 meters behind the column, moving on foot because the trucks were full of supplies. By the time they reached the emplacement, the Americans would be gone or dead, and either way, the column would still be burning. He could call for artillery. The German batteries on the Alban Hills had the range and the accuracy, but the coordinates he'd have to provide were the coordinates of his own gun position, a position that might still contain German gunners, might still be recoverable, might be the only thing stopping the Americans from advancing down the road toward the staging area. Riker chose retreat. The column reversed in sections, vehicles backing away from the flames, drivers fighting steering wheels never designed for rapid rearward movement. 2 trucks collided. A half-track through a track trying to turn in ground, softened by weeks of rain. The machine guns kept firing at the emplacement, but the Americans had stopped shooting back, either dead or withdrawing, impossible to tell which. The whole engagement lasted 4 minutes. The column lost 7 vehicles confirmed destroyed, 3 more damaged, and an unknown number of personnel casualties that the reports redacted or never counted. The gun position was recovered an hour later by infantry, who found nothing but spent brass, American boot prints in the mud, and a breech block still warm from firing. Riker's report used the phrase tactical surprise from an unexpected quarter. His commanding officer crossed it out and wrote something else in the margin. The notation survived in the captured file. Enemy showed initiative beyond expected parameters. Beyond expected parameters. The phrase kept appearing in German reports from that winter. Anzio, Normandy, the Ardennes, the Vosges. It became a kind of shorthand for something the doctrine had no words for. Anzio was a supply officer's nightmare and a scavenger's paradise. The beachhead measured 7 miles deep at its widest point. Every ton of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, every crate of rations had to cross open water under observation from the Alban Hills. Then travel roads that German artillery had pre-registered to the meter. Ships sank in the harbor. Trucks burned on the coastal road. The mathematics of logistics said the beachhead should have starved. It didn't starve because Americans stopped thinking like Americans. The squad that captured the Paquet 40 wasn't unique. They weren't even unusual. Intelligence reports from January through May 1944 document American units operating German MG, 42 machine guns, German mortars, German Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, German vehicles with American stars hastily painted over German crosses. One rifle company in the 3rd Division maintained a captured Kubelwagen for 6 weeks, German Jeep, American driver, Italian gasoline siphoned from a wrecked fuel truck. The motor pool sergeant listed it in his equipment log as vehicle enemy, 4-wheel, appropriated. The British did something similar at Tobruk in 1941, holding a desert perimeter with a patchwork of captured Italian artillery and German vehicles scrounged from the wire. The similarities end at the surface. Tobruk was desperation. Anzio was something else, systematic, almost industrial. American quartermasters established collection points for captured equipment. Armorers learned to maintain weapons they'd never been trained on. The whole beachhead became a laboratory for improvisation. The Germans noticed they had to. A foreign military studies report compiled after the war, German generals writing for American historians, explaining how they lost, contains a section on enemy material adaptation. The language is clinical, the tone almost wounded. American forces demonstrated unexpected facility with captured equipment, the report states. Weapons were employed within hours of capture, often by personnel with no formal training. This created tactical uncertainty at the small unit level. Tactical uncertainty. The phrase sounds clinical too, and it was meant to. It doesn't capture what it felt like to be a German gunner, watching your own rounds land among your own vehicles. It erases Hauptmann Riker's 11 seconds of paralysis, the 19-year-old loader's frozen hands, the machine gunner in the covering position, who kept firing at the sandbag emplacement because the alternative was accepting that Americans had already won. The smell of burning fuel carried across the beachhead that morning. Men in foxholes 3 kilometers away looked up and saw the smoke column rising from the road, black and oily against the January gray. They didn't know what it meant. They couldn't know that a squad of infantry had done what artillery couldn't: disrupted a supply column, delayed the counterattack, bought time measured in hours and days. The squad leader who pulled that firing lanyard never received a medal for it. The after-action report mentions aggressive action against enemy logistics, but doesn't name him. His service record shows a Bronze Star from later in the campaign, a Purple Heart from wounds received in February, and a discharge in 1945. He went home to somewhere in the Midwest. The records don't specify where, but the German files remember what he did. Not his name. They never learned his name, but the effect. The counterattack, scheduled for 3 days later, was postponed by 36 hours because the supplies that burned on that road had to be replaced from depots further back. 36 hours gave the 6th Corps time to strengthen positions that held by meters. The whole campaign balanced on margins that thin. The PaK 40 itself was destroyed by German artillery 2 days after the Americans abandoned it. The emplacement took a direct hit from a 105mm howitzer, the kind of fire support the Americans couldn't match in those early weeks. The gun that had killed 7 vehicles in 4 minutes became twisted metal and scattered sandbags. No one photographed the wreckage. No one needed to. The gun had already done something more permanent than survival. It had proved that American soldiers could pick up any tool, German, Italian, their own, and make it work, not because they understood the engineering, because they didn't need to. They understood something else instead. The German word for it was unheimlich, uncanny, beyond the normal order of things. The American word was simpler. They called it getting the job done. The paper smelled like mildew and tobacco smoke. German filing clerks chain-smoked while they typed, and the habit left its residue on every document that passed through 14th Army headquarters in the winter of 1944. The report on the supply column incident filled 3 pages, single-spaced, the typewriter ribbon fading toward the margins where the clerk had struck the keys too lightly. The document classified the engagement as enemy action, unconventional. No subcategory existed for what had actually happened. German tactical manuals ran to thousands of pages. They covered artillery deployment, counter-battery procedures, defense against air attack, response to partisan activity, coordination with armor, withdrawal under pressure. The index listed scenarios alphabetically, cross-referenced by terrain type, force ratio, and weather conditions. Somewhere in those pages existed doctrine for nearly every contingency the General Staff had imagined over decades of professional study. No page addressed what to do when Americans captured your gun and learned to operate it before you could organize a response. The gap wasn't incompetence. German doctrine was thorough, precisely because German planners took the profession seriously. They war-game scenarios, analyzed after-action reports, refined procedures through layers of committee review. The system worked. It had crushed Poland in weeks, France in 6. It held the Eastern Front against numerical superiority that should have been overwhelming. The system assumed the enemy would fight like a system. Hierarchies, chains of command, soldiers who waited for orders, who deferred to specialists, who operated within the boundaries of their training. The American who pulled the firing lanyard on that PaK 40 had no training on German artillery. His loader had no training. The machinist calling out elevation corrections had never seen a German range table in his life. They did it anyway. The 14th Army intelligence officer who reviewed the incident report wrote a marginal note that survived in the captured files. The handwriting is cramped, difficult to read, the pen pressing hard enough to leave grooves in the paper. The translation reads, "Recommend revision of defensive procedures for artillery positions in forward areas. Enemy has demonstrated capability for immediate employment of captured weapons without apparent need for familiarization period." The recommendation went nowhere. There was no procedure to write. You cannot train men to prevent the unpreventable, cannot doctrine your way out of an enemy who doesn't read your doctrine. The squad leader's name appears nowhere in German records. The Americans who filed the after-action report listed him by rank and unit designation, not by name, standard practice for routine patrol summaries. His Purple Heart citation from February mentions wounds received during a different engagement entirely. The Bronze Star is equally silent on the matter of the gun. What the records do preserve is the cost. 7 German vehicles destroyed. Unknown personnel casualties. The reports use the phrase losses commensurate with material destruction, which translates to numbers no one wanted to count. One supply column delayed 36 hours, one counterattack postponed, one beachhead that held when the mathematics said it shouldn't. The American losses from the engagement, one man wounded during the withdrawal, shrapnel from a German mortar round that found the drainage ditch 30 seconds after the squad cleared it. He was evacuated to the beach hospital, treated, and returned to his unit 11 days later. His medical file classifies the wound as fragment, enemy ordnance, lower extremity, minor. The German gunners who died in the emplacement, the ones killed in the first 60 seconds, were buried in a temporary cemetery near Aprilia. The graves were marked with wooden crosses, standard Wehrmacht issue, the names written in grease pencil that faded in the spring rains. The cemetery was relocated twice during the war. The bodies moved to a permanent site near Rome in 1955. The crosses were replaced with stone markers. The grease pencil became carved letters. The 19-year-old loader who survived, the one the Americans took prisoner, spent the rest of the war in a camp in Kansas. He was repatriated in 1946. The debriefing transcript runs 4 pages, mostly about unit dispositions and supply routes. One question near the end asks what he observed about American soldiers. His answer fills 3 lines. The translation is imperfect. The file number is NARARG 407, Box 1241, Folder 9. The next morning, another column moved down another road toward the beachhead. Different vehicles, different drivers, same supplies.